Here we go.
Oh, I have to click accept. Okay.
All right. Welcome, Samantha. Great to have you here. And before I jump in with the questions, I'm just going to ask you if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, who you are, what you do in the world, or anything else you want to share.
Well, I am a Southeast Asian Indian Chinese who was brought up in Singapore, a highly westernized Asian globalized society. And then I went to study mechanical engineering in Edinburgh in Scotland. I lived in the UK for a total of 10 years, up and down the UK, etc., working mainly as a sustainable design engineer within the building design, urban design sector. And then after about 10 years of that, I went into Sweden, where I essentially worked with Europe's second largest architecture firm, a third of whom obviously are on maternity leave because it's Sweden, or paternity leave. And I was there for a couple of years working mainly, kind of got poached. I was meant to be working in building physics because that's what I'm a chartered engineer for. And I got poached by the social sustainability team working in urban design, looking at essentially more equitable design processes, also working with the landscape team. So these are very large teams. We're talking like 150, 200 people type situation. And working on process design as well as new innovative business models, I guess, so new services that we can provide to really get the benefits to the societies or communities that we want to benefit. So that was in Sweden, and then I sort of did nothing for a while. I got invited here and there to speak at different things, and then ended up in South Africa, where I essentially realized that I need to come back to Southeast Asia. So here I am now. I'm in the Philippines. I came back just before the pandemic, and I started to develop essentially my own urban consultancy and trying to find partners to work together on some of the issues that I think are really important. So the first being about our climate futures here in Southeast Asia, which are incredibly dire and harsh, and very few people actually know about it, let alone are planning for it. And secondly, around our sort of what does well-being look like for us, you know? So we're constantly importing essentially Western ideas of what urban well-being is, and even the concept of the city, right, is a Western import. This is not something that we had in Southeast Asia because we had seafaring empires. So it's not really something that you would have like a major city unless it was, you know, for royalty or administrative reasons. Not a city in the way that it is now, which is essentially for extractive economic opportunity. So the third aspect of the consultancy is focused on rural well-being. So the reason why people move to cities is economic opportunity. That's because that's being decimated in rural areas. So trying to understand the balance and the interplay between rural and urban, that's something that I'm involved in. But I'm also doing essentially explorations with a really amazing collective of women across the global south who are riffing on this question: what does planetary regeneration mean? And we land on this this main focus that planetary regeneration is the regeneration of the global south. And then what does that mean? And so we go deep into those questions, and we really try to engage with the tangibility of it rather than the philosophy of it. Yeah, so that's who I am.
Awesome. And just in the spirit of transparency, I'll share just briefly that we are connected beyond this interview. So we know each other personally and professionally. We sort of hang out virtually and collaborate. I'm sure already by the time anybody's watching this, the Fisheye Cafe will have gone completely viral. So people may recognize you from there. And so we have a chance to connect and share ideas. And I would say, Samantha, I think of you as somebody who has really sort of inspired and provoked me to understand a lot of different things, and certainly really opened my eyes to some of the questions and opportunities around the global south. So that would be how you and I are connected. And just before we start to go into the questions for this analysis. As I mentioned to you in inviting you here, we're taking a closer look at Alphabet, also known as Google, the company. And so I just wanted to check if you have any commercial or other relationship with Google, how you are connected, if at all, to the company.
Well, I'm a consumer of their products, as probably most of us on the planet today. But otherwise, no, I have no other connection with Google.
Okay, so they're not a client or a funder of any of the work that you're doing at this point. Yeah, cool. And I think you're right. I don't know anybody who isn't a consumer in some way, shape, or form. And just to level set a little bit, are there specific products of Google's that you're using that you would say, yep, that's what I use, or just kind of search engine? Like, are you using? Yeah, go ahead.
I would say I'm a pretty basic consumer of Google products, so I don't go into the premium Google Suite options, etc. For example, running the collective, I don't tend to seek out, like, I try to stay away actually from Google products, but they're so everywhere and it's very difficult to or it gets very expensive if you would like to access such services outside of the Alphabet ecosystem.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for that. And just before we start to go into details on Google's business model and how it connects to the future, I'd love to hear in your own words how you would describe the future we want. And I'll just clarify what I'm looking for here, and you know better than anybody how many different phrases there are out there, from sort of sustainability to regenerative economics or regeneration, sustainable development, etc. So there's tons of jargon. And of course, that's just English. I'd love to hear in your words what you believe the desirable future looks like. And we'll sort of hold that as a bit of a benchmark for the other questions in the conversation.
I think this is obviously a very complex question, and there's a lot of different ways that I can answer this, but I'll answer it from the point of view of the distant future and also the near future, right? So I'll start with the distant future, because otherwise, what are we working towards, right? So the distant future that I want and I try to work towards as much as I know, or I can, as much as I'm aware of, is a world where we have just relationships between all living and non-living things on the planet. And just relationships, i.e. talking about justice and equity, etc., means that there is a certain sort of natural order that has a dynamism that isn't necessarily well defined. So it's not possible to define it, but it's also not possible to define how it will be because of the dynamism. So it's an ever-changing balance, essentially, that I'm looking for. And justice is not something that is also 100%. It's something that we constantly strive to, of course, but it depends on the balance within which we find ourselves. So for example, at the moment, we're talking about, human civilization having led to planetary systems collapse. So this is the collapse of every single ecosystemic indicator that we can measure on the planet today. And so a just relationship would be not that, right? But what would it look like to be not that in each different place, at each different time, etc.? That's something I can't answer. So if we're looking to that for our distant future, then what are we looking at for our near future? How do we start working towards those things, right? So there are two aspects of sustainability or regeneration that I think we really need to be focusing on, and those are ecocide and ethnocide. Ecocide, I think, we're all familiar with, essentially the destruction of ecosystems' abilities to, one, regenerate themselves, but also the fact that they are destroyed. So there's something that is lost in terms of biological knowledge on the planet that we don't understand as human beings. And ethnocide being ways of life that are being destroyed. So I'm not talking about genocide where people are being killed. I'm talking about ethnocide where cultures are being killed. And the importance of these cultures in maintaining and passing on knowledge of how to maintain just relationships within ecosystems on the planet that do not lead to planetary collapse. So I'm specifically talking about very marginalized cultures, which are outside of our current globalized civilization, that need to be protected and need to not experience ethnocide. So these are the two things I think that we can be working on in our near future. And I see not enough folk, especially not enough folk in essentially the ones who are dictating economic processes or even trends that they are focused on at all, especially folk who say that they're, you know, sustainability consultants.
Yep. Okay, great. That's super helpful. So realizing it's sort of an impossible question, and that's a multi-tiered answer with a lot lurking behind it. As much as possible, hold that hold that thought. And as we're looking at the impacts and the activities of Google, we'll use that future as the context, if you will. And I also want to really emphasize that as we're talking about Google here, I mean, they're a massive company, right? Like they're pretty much in every country. Their revenues in 2021 were 259 billion. Like they're the size of the Canadian economy in one company in 1 year. They touch lots of different things. So as much as possible when we're talking about them, I'd like to really stay focused on their business model, how they earn revenue, essentially what they do to generate that income, which is the business, whether we like it or not. But of course, it is a very complex business and means lots of things. So if we need to go down a few extra trails, we can. So with that emphasis in mind and your vision of the future, I'd like to start to go into the impact that Google may have on that future. And to begin with, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the positive impacts, what you see as positive from their activities, you know, what they do as a business, and how those impacts may be contributing to that positive future vision that you just described in as much detail as you can.
I can go into a lot of detail, so I think you're going to have to stop me at some point. But essentially, Google has invented and continued to maintain a new type of commons for interacting, for engaging, for collaborating locally, internationally, synchronously, asynchronously, and it has done so at very low cost. Granted, you need to have internet infrastructure that is actually reliable. Granted, you need to have devices that can access the internet. Granted, you need to have those skill sets to be able to use those devices to access the internet. But once you have achieved those three aspects, things open up for you. You can very easily and quickly collaborate, share information, data, create resources, etc. As long as there are these foundations in place. Now, the positive impacts, I think, about how Google has continued to develop the platforms that it provides at the low cost end of their business has allowed a lot of volunteers and NGO employees to be able to coordinate efforts towards trying to stop, let's say, ecocide and ethnocide. So in terms of the near future that I'm talking about here, what Google has done is normalized this kind of way of collaborating where we can be very actively engaging with folk who, for example, in the areas that Possible Futures works in, may not be comfortable to do that in public life because of the dangers associated with essentially whistleblowing or being an activist in certain countries, in certain contexts, on certain grounds, with certain relationships with certain companies, etc. And Google allows a certain way to sort of, to a certain degree, that allows that collaboration that needs to take place so that people don't have to essentially expose themselves, for lack of a better word, to the authorities who might actually be, let's say, on the corporate side and wanting to protect their relationship with that company. And so authorities might clamp down on folk who are protesting and calling them essentially what in the Philippines happens. We are red tagging people, where we're putting them literally on a red list and the military is sent out to go look for them. So this is a very, I guess, specific way that I see, but very important, because it enables a lot of the more dangerous work to be done less dangerously, for example, just from the fact that we have these services that we can access online. Now, having said that, Google has invented these services and then they continue to monopolize the market, etc. And so I can't speak to whether, you know, in a different world, you know, someone else would have invented or maintained or provided, let's say, competition to be able to share information in this way or coordinate in this way, etc. Right? So I can't say that. I can definitely say that other people seem to have tried to do such a thing in order to serve the activist communities I'm talking about who are trying to work against ecocide and ethnocide, right? However, for one reason or another, I think largely due to quality and flexibility of the services provided, not necessarily due to popularity, which is, you know, what's most likely kind of expected. People tend to have moved away from those alternative services and back to Google. So every now and again, you hear of, you know, a new platform kind of like arising, and oh, this is something that you can do. Privacy is like really good, etc. But time and time again, folk come back to Google, one, because it's so easily accessible. It's almost like the default app, right, that you have on your phones, and it's sort of been made really convenient for people to be able to know about these tools, develop these skill sets, etc. So the other really smart thing about the design that I think Google has had a really positive impact on a lot of, you know, in looking at the future I want to have in the near future, and also the people who are working towards that near future. The positive impacts that Google has had in terms of the design of its services, making it, again, really easily accessible, really easily visible, and very, like, user interface wise, very easy to use based on basically the tools that people have already been familiar with in the 90s, in the 2000s, etc. And the fact that it has very well integrated, so all the tools are very well integrated, right? And it's very accessible on any mobile device, for example, as well as obviously a desktop, etc. I think Google is also doing a lot with regards to, essentially Google provides a commons service, which is trying to provide folk the information that they're looking for, literally within, you know, a split second. And there's pros and cons here, but the positive side of it definitely is the fact that people are able to be, it's an excuse now, you know, if I haven't had time to just Google it, that's kind of on me, you know. So it's no longer an excuse to show up to a meeting, let's say on something, and then you're like, yeah, I haven't had time to actually understand what we're talking about here, for example. So one example I can bring up is within the stray care community, for example, last week, someone found a litter of abandoned kittens. So it's an unwanted litter from somebody who clearly has a pet who became pregnant, etc. And they were sort of just left in a box at the side of the street. And it was in the hot sun. The kittens, they can't survive, you know, a few hours without their mom. So it became a serious problem. And so she took them in and she fed them some human milk. And then meanwhile, she was asking for help on social media. That's how we knew about it. And we eventually got the kittens, and we got them a volunteer foster with an incubator, etc. So at the moment, they're currently struggling to survive. So they're about 5 days now with the fosterer, and they're having really, really bad bloody diarrhea. Sorry, too much information probably. But a lot of that we think is attributable to the fact that they were fed human milk because it's toxic to baby kittens. And so this is a quick Google search, you know, this is a very quick Google search. What do you feed neonate kittens, right? And so that becomes something, you know, I have to go back essentially to the rescuer, the initial person who fed them, to say, like, why didn't you look this up? Why didn't you? It literally takes you 2 seconds to be able to do that. So I think this is a positive impact because, one, it enables folk to educate themselves very easily, and there's no excuse not to do that anymore. And secondly, it enables folk to, for me, let's say, to justify the fact I don't have to explain the whole complexity of why this is toxic to kittens. I just have to send you a bunch of links that I found on Google and say that, look, it's it's all here if you just did a quick Google search, right? So we are able to get to a very quick point of a level of understanding just because Google has provided that service for us, because we can see all the hits, all the different resources that we can access. So it provides you a landscape, basically, of what the basic level understanding of a thing should be if you're thinking that you should jump into this thing, let's say.
Mhm.
So this helps us in terms of the positive impact when we're trying to bring folk into the space of, trying to question sustainability, for example, or trying to get involved in human rights work, or trying to get in, organizational justice work, etc. You can Google it. You should Google it. It's very easy for you to do that. And you should be able to understand what you're, align yourself with a baseline international standard of understanding, essentially, of what convention looks like in this particular context. So this is essentially a way that Google sort of counters, because where else are you going to get this information? Where else you're going to go to a library and look it up and, sit there for like 6 hours trying to figure out, okay, but this author says this, but that author says that. Whereas because you're now able to access a lot of and how many hits each page gets, etc. So what tends to look like essentially the norm or the international norm, etc., that you can access, learn, study, and then question on your own as well, because you can look at other sources, you can compare and contrast. What are these people saying? What are those people saying, etc., in a very quick and accessible way. So I would say in terms of the Google Suite services and the Google search services that are being offered that tend to be the most low-cost options that people who are working towards the future that I want are using, there are loads of positive impacts. And it's not something that we think about anymore. So it's something that we take for granted, which is a positive. We should be taking the commons for granted. But at the same time, I think we should be asking questions about how these things come to be.
And that last phrase is probably a good segue into the flip side of that. So staying in the same track of how Google earns its keep and what they do, what are some of the negative impacts from the activities that they currently do when you think about how it may be inadvertently undermining the future that you've described? Actually, I shouldn't even say inadvertently. It's not for me to say what
we don't know,
happening. Just
right? Like,
observing where are there impacts that are potentially undermining that future.
Yeah. So what is the system or the culture that is currently leading us to planetary collapse, or has led us, I should say, to planetary collapse, right? If we understand that, then we can understand how businesses such as Alphabet are helping to perpetuate those systems or cultures. Right? And this is something that I think we should really get focused on in our near future. But I think in order to do that, we have to understand the distant past and how we got to this point, right? This is the entire project of Possible Futures, the collective that I spoke of in decolonial sustainability and regeneration. So in Possible Futures, we talk about this one world. This is a one world described by a Scottish academic actually, called John Law in 2011. He described this kind of one world view that has been systematically cannibalizing other worldviews that exist on our planet within our human societies. And in some cases, he argues non-human societies that can be argued to have a worldview. For example, dolphin societies, bonobo societies, etc. Right? So when we are considering what exactly is this one worldview, where did it come from, how did it nucleate, what are the patterns of behavior that helps us to identify the worldview, we come back to many different nucleations that all sort of feed along the same lines of agglomerating power. So the cannibalism happens on a cultural level in the in the basic instance, but how it manifests can look like genocide, can look like, World War II, etc., etc., etc. So there are many different ways to think about it, but I'm going to start from the colonial context, because this is important when we center on the dominant power structures that are very real. They are manifesting very real things in the lives of everyday people all around the world. And so the dominant power structures that I'd like to point to in terms of how Google plays a part in this, right, is essentially European world domination through colonization. This happened, or started to happen, 600 years ago, and it's still continuing today. It's still ongoing today. We are not, undoing that in any sort of way. So if we consider that this is the one worldview that is cannibalizing all other worlds, then it's very easy to sort of see this and how it happens, what are the patterns of behavior, by simply understanding the act of invasion, the act of colonization, the act of ethnocide, not just a genocide, but killing ways of life. So on the one hand, killing people so that they cannot practice their way of life, so that we can take over their lands and use their resources, etc. But on the other hand, killing ways of life, meaning that to convert them to your way of life. So one way of doing that is to, like, Christianity, for example, right? Convert them into siding with you on how you see the world. So this is the way that worldviews cannibalize other worldviews. Because generation after generation, you essentially are indoctrinating, new generations of folk, and obviously population is ever expanding, into your worldview. And you have these weapons of mass destruction that essentially allow you to keep doing that, because you're making profit off of essentially the resources that come then under your control when you expand your worldview in this way. So this one world that I'm talking of, right, today looks like a propaganda war. Today, it looks like children who are being born in more traditional families. And tradition, by the way, is a bastardization now because of our 600 years of colonization. So it's hard to say that it's really traditional, or is it a colonized tradition, a manipulated tradition, etc. But let's use this analogy for now, parents and children. So parents are largely, let's say in this scenario, they're more conservative, they're more traditional, and they have some sort of, values that look back towards the 60s or the 70s. And today, the new generation that's coming up are more looking at a highly sort of commodified or westernized lifestyle, where the things that we want, the work that we want to be able to do, the way that we want to eat or dress, etc., how we expect to live in the future, all of these things have been shaped by this one world of European world domination. We no longer want to, we no longer want the things that give us back our traditions, our cultures, right? We instead want to adopt something else because it's constantly being sold to us as that. So that's where we come to Google, because Google is so everywhere, right? And it sells ad space to the highest bidder. So essentially, if you're a powerful player in this one world, meaning that you have a lot of resources to put into marketing. So let's talk about Ivy Park line, for example, from Beyonce, right? Beyonce herself is an entrepreneur. She's a very talented singer, yes, but she's done, a lot more. She's a businesswoman. She's done a lot more with her brand, her business, not just at selling herself, but at selling a lot of things, right? She's a salesperson. She's a business person. And her model is really not to care about, where my products are made or how it's made, or if I've stolen ideas from other people, I don't credit them. You should be happy. I've, done you a favor by not crediting you, but using your stuff. I don't know how that works, but, legally, she has the power to essentially quash a lot of these claims because of the sheer wealth that she has. to hire the right lawyers and to impose, you know, whatever oppressive tactics that you would like to do. And this is the world of business. This is how it works. Because if you have basically the wealth to do it, then nothing really gets in your way. So I illustrate this because this is something that is powerful. Right? I want to bring in this concept of power and who is powerful versus who is not powerful, right? So you can't say that the artist that Beyonce stole work from has power in the situation, because they don't. You never know their names. That alone is like how little power that they have, right? And so when someone like Beyonce buys out, like, for an entire demographic of people, because you can pick obviously your target audience to whom these ads are being shown to, just to promote her line of, you know, her new collection from Ivy Park or whatever. And so that's on one side of it. And the other side of it is that she's been so everywhere for like, what, 25 years. And so she's like this dominant cultural figure that everybody wants to emulate. She's this celebrity that has been in everybody's lives. I guess during your era it was probably Madonna or something, but Madonna wasn't trying to say.
I was just thinking, as you described her as a businesswoman, I'm like, yeah, like Madonna. Totally.
Yeah, but Madonna wasn't doing it to this degree.
No, there wasn't that degree to do it too.
There wasn't that degree, exactly. So this is something that Google, and you know, it's not just Google, but this is what I'm saying is being facilitated, right? So this whole, you know, it's a couple of generations of people, women especially, right, who are obsessed, enamored with Beyonce because of the one world, the entertainment world that is kind of shipped out as basically American propaganda to the rest of the world, is part of this one world. Like, why are people in Zimbabwe who are livestock farmers, why are they searching for YouTube videos of Beyonce's, you know, new live performance? This is the one world that I'm talking about, right? And not only that, she has the power to buy out ads, to constantly sort of do her propaganda, essentially, so that you are engaged. This is how you get trapped back into the system of consumption, exploitation, etc., through her products that she's made in order for her to hoard wealth, right? So I use the example of Beyonce because I think everybody loves Beyonce. I could use the same example for Oprah, etc. I don't really want to use, you know, folk like Bill Gates, because I think, you know, there's already a lot of things that we can see or feel or know about, you know, rich billionaires, especially white men. But when it's a Black woman who's doing this, right, that is how I want to describe this one world, because her culture, her traditions have been wiped off. She's not looking to, you know, find her roots back in Africa. In fact, she's looking to exploit Africa for their culture, for their talent, in order to serve her business model. And Google is facilitating all of that by having their fingers in everything, to be able to go to Beyonce and say, look, this is the suite of things that we can provide you with. Do you want to buy our service? And so that is happening for every business that Google works with, all the millions of partners that they talk about in their annual statements.
Yeah.
So it's facilitating essentially people with the power to propagate this one world that is killing our planet, that enables them to kill our planet faster. That's what Google is doing through this kind of business model. But this is not to say that, you know, Google is evil. I can't make that judgment. I'm not there in that space. But it's to say, this is the role that Google is currently playing now in terms of pushing us into planetary collapse.
Yeah.
So that would be a pretty big negative.
Yeah. Yes. Are there more? I mean, I've got a follow-on question, but are there other negative impacts that you see based on the business model sort of undermining the future that you described?
There's another one, which I think is also very damaging. So essentially, Google wants to, it's PR. Google wants to look like they are providing a common service, which they are, yes. and it's great. But they also don't want folk to know that they are providing the common service for the main purpose of business profits, exploitation. And it goes back to the entire marketing greenwashing thing as well, about social sustainability, you know, your responsibility as a corporation on this planet. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is the sustainability sham. So Google has been very loud about how they're moving their business to 100% renewable energy, and everything's like, you know, look at this great new headquarters with like acres and acres of solar panels on the roof and etc. and all these things. So that is very damaging in thinking about ecocide and ethnocide, because again, it's the consumption model that we're promoting here, when a business as large and powerful as Google is, you know, essentially showing off that this is something that we can do, and you should, you know, almost thank us for doing such a thing. And so it gets a lot of attention, and it has a lot of influence in how, one, the solar industry develops and the ways that they market themselves, and two, the ways that building trends are in architecture, etc. And this has a very intangible influence on designers all around the world, thinking about, you know, building designers, urban designers, and city municipalities, the way that they think about foreign investment into their city. So we're, you know, for example, it's like a big deal to have like an Apple flagship store in your town or whatever. And for some reason, they call it a town hall, when it's a corporation who is building a retail store in like prime property within your city, for example. So this is the blurry line between holistic sustainability, like a real holistic, decentralized, community-focused sustainability, versus the corporate greenwashing that exists to basically congratulate themselves for what? Further consumption, further exploitation, further promotion of a model that is leading us into planetary collapse. And so this is very dangerous, because they control the narratives on this. You know, they essentially control the narratives on anything that they would like to, because of the power that they have, you know, just as what I talked about for Beyonce. But this in particular, this about, you know, the whole, what is sustainability, what is sustainable development, and dictating those ideas are very dangerous. So this isn't necessarily related to the business model that Google has. It's probably more related to what Google thinks its footprint is and how it's trying to mitigate that. But I would argue that that marketing essentially value is part of their business model, because their business model is predicated upon this idea that they are providing, Google is good for the planet. You know, that they're providing really healthy, great things that you should thank them for.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm going to share my screen for a second to ask this next question. And it's, you know, because we've chatted a bit about this, that part of what's led me to even do this project is sort of a reaction against traditional materiality, which boils everything down into a 2x2 matrix. So I'm being a little bit hypocritical by asking you to review the following 2x2 matrix. And so in other words, and I'm hoping you now see a Google slide with your name at the top. And I'll just explain a little bit what's here before putting the question directly to you. So, and I'm sort of calling myself a hypocrite because I think this question is sort of impossible to answer. It's an oversimplification of a very complex company in a very complex future that you described. But I'm nonetheless going to ask you to reflect. So what I'd like to hear your thoughts on is, if you had to give a ranking of Google as you know, the impact it's having on either contributing to or undermining the future. And I'm giving a couple axes here. So the vertical axis is impact on ecosystem health, overall global, and the horizontal axis is impact on societal health human health, you could say, and I recognize even there, like I'm really just talking about humans, but we know that society is very interrelated with other non-humans. The midpoint is 0. Anything below 0 is undermining. Anything above 0 is contributing to. And I've left the Google bubble way over here to not suggest where it ought to be. And my question is, where would you place Google based on its current approach in terms of contributing to or undermining the future?
So I think it's important to qualify what I'm about to say by saying like 5 is essentially, given Google's mission, what is the best that it could do at doing a positive impact on ecosystem health, given Google's mission, right? Because essentially I would have to wipe everything that I know about Google and the way that it conducts business or the way that it moves through the world and focus on its mission to understand what is the potential for it. Because then otherwise I'm putting at 5, I don't know, like World War III and indigenous people take over the world or something. Like there's no context otherwise of what 5 is, right? So I'm going to put 5 as if Google was a company that had the amount of money that it did, or the amount of influence that it did, and actually wanted to carry out its mission, right? That would be 5.
Okay, I'm gonna try to phrase the question better and see if it solves
Okay.
for what you're describing.
Yeah.
So, and let me just collect my thought for a second here.
Okay.
When you think about the future you want, so the
Right.
context is that future you described. Maybe Google doesn't even exist in it, right? So the nested context is the future you want. If you had to say, based on the Google of today, the reality as best you understand it today, Google is critically undermining, or Google is significantly contributing to that future. If you think they're critically undermining the future, the context that you described, then they'd be somewhere in the below 0. Or maybe they're critically undermining on society, but not ecosystem, or other way around. Maybe they're critically undermining on ecosystem, but not society. But they're either undermining or contributing, in your opinion, to that future that you desire.
Okay. So in that case, Google as it is right now, in terms of how it's contributing or undermining the future that I want, is very, very low on both counts.
How low? Like if you guided me to place it, if you gave the numbers, like -5 is the lowest you can go on this scale, unless you want to go off the scale.
It would probably -5, -5.
Okay. Yeah. And you've explained, I think, largely why, but do you want to put in a nutshell why that's the ranking you give them?
The bulk of the business model is geared towards powerful entities, personal or corporate, who are perpetuating this one world that is undermining both ecosystem health and societal health.
Yeah.
And when I say the bulk, I mean, even though I have brought up the positive impacts of how, small grassroots operations are being enabled by Google, that doesn't show up on their business accounting at all. This is not an area that they're focused, that they're not concerned about those customers.
Yeah, it's not how they make money.
It's not how they make money. And if anything, when we're thinking about the business model and the financial incentives for them to, the way that they've set it up, essentially, we have seen that lack of accountability, not only with regards to, their previously valid "Don't Be Evil" motto that was encoded into their code of conduct and then taken away after 18 years. We've also seen a lack of accountability to governments to the point where it's very irresponsible, essentially. I mean, we can just talk about tax evasion as one thing, and that alone is undermining, like that alone would be -5 on societal health, let's say. Not fulfilling your responsibilities to the states that you're supposedly trying to like help out or collaborate with, but instead taking requests, accepting requests from states, powerful states and oligarchs to suppress certain search results, etc. So to curate essentially how folk interact with information that should be available to them. And not just that, but then to work with authorities to find people who are searching certain things and flagging them up then to those groups of, so on the whole, like in terms of societal health, Google is one of the worst offenders that I can think of on the planet. And for ecosystem health, I've already talked about this. On the one hand, it's related to the ethnicide, like you already mentioned. But on the other hand, their show of what sustainable development is, their essentially their position of influence in dictating what sustainable development looks like or what we should be striving towards, and then having the ability to push that propaganda and convince, folk like us in sustainable design that this is what we should be striving to, when it is perpetuating still ecocide. So just the sheer power of that message puts it at -5 on the ecosystem health scale.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'm going to stop sharing here. Super helpful explanation. Thank you. And I'm just going to push us into a couple more questions and then give you back your morning there. These ones kind of flow into the more imaginative space. So getting a bit creative and thinking beyond current reality, just for fun. So this just in, you are in charge of everything and nothing is in the way. So you've got absolute opportunity to guide. What changes would you make at Google Alphabet?
Dissolve the company. That's pretty much it. And then what to do with the products is essentially to give ownership to grassroots, particularly indigenous design groups who can take that technology and do something else with it. One thing I didn't mention as part of the One World thing, because some of the products are really, they just have to be burned. They're not salvageable. And one of them is the AI products, or the product range that is being used in the services that Google is providing. And Google is also providing the AI as a separate service to their corporate clients, etc. But the AI itself, has very concerning, Edward Snowden talked about this, way back in the day as well. It has very concerning behavioral patterns that are more extreme than than what is exhibited in our human society, in racism, white supremacy, in classism, and especially leaning more towards essentially celebrity propaganda or oligarch propaganda. So when we look at any AI that is being developed, especially by folk who are essentially curating all the information on the web, we have to keep in mind that the web is a very, I mean, you've heard of the dark web, right? And that actually makes up 96% of the entire web. So when we're talking about AI and what influences it or what gets put into it, we also have to understand who designs these AI and the fact that they come from not only the one world, but the heart of the one world. Essentially, we're talking about Silicon Valley, you know, very privileged, highly educated people who have their egos right up there, who knows where, right? And this is then the AI that they're creating, essentially, to do what? To provide commons services, to facilitate how common services are provided. And if those conversations, I'm sorry, are not owned, if the design of these products are not owned by the grassroots communities that they should be serving as the commons, then you should not call them the commons. You should not be operating as the commons, and you certainly should not be selling them to communities who don't need another layer of white supremacy or racism onto the way that they operate. And some of these things are very difficult to spot. They're difficult to navigate. And so for me, it needs to go. It has to just not exist. We need to start from scratch again and maybe design it in a different way using perhaps the technologies that Google has developed so far. So that's what I'm saying. Some of the products have literally to be scrapped. And some of the products have to be repurposed or redesigned in order to fit the needs of the grassroots communities that I think have great potential to use these technologies to accelerate the future that I want. Yeah.
Love it. Well, that thought experiment ended and you're no longer in charge of everything, but new thought experiment, you are, you have a direct line with the CEO. So with Sundar Pichai, he will take your call, but you've only got 30 seconds because he's really busy. So what do you tell him in the 30 seconds you have?
I'd like to show you pictures of the foster cat family that I currently have. 30 seconds is a pointless conversation, and Pichai is a pointless person to have a conversation with. This has nothing to do with Pichai at all.
Yeah.
I want to show him pictures of cats.
Cool. All right. That's my last question for you, other than, is there anything I didn't ask you that you feel would be relevant to share about Alphabet, Google's role in the future you want?
Yeah, I do actually. So the last thing would be transparency. I would like for large companies such as this to be very transparent and open about what they actually do in the world, who they're actually working with, who their biggest clients are, what they do with them, etc. Because if you're providing a commons service or you purport to, then your company is the commons. So act like it and start being accountable to not just the states, but I think the communities who are most marginalized in your business model. Because that's what it means. With great power comes great responsibility. That is what it means, you know. And I don't see the responsibility part essentially being worked on at all at any of these companies, let alone for someone as huge and massive as Alphabet. And the other side of it as well, I would like for political leanings to be very open. So, I mean, this is also the case for Cambridge Analytica. Like it or not, it is quite open with who they work with and etc. But it takes investigative journalism to essentially open up those things. So I would like for that kind of information to be publicized by the company and taking responsibility. This is what I would like to see. And then finally, what I would like to see is in terms of, you know, the metrics that they are currently using in a lot of these investment calls, the kinds of ways that they determine success or progress, etc. I would like to see additional metrics on how we have tangibly contributed to ecocide and ethnocide in the last quarter. I would like to see those metrics on the investor call as well. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful punctuation mark. Anything more to add?
I think that's largely it. I mean, this is a very brief conversation about, in a way, it's about the future I want in the perspective of a company that is destroying, I think, the possibility of that future. But in another way, I think this is a futile conversation for me. So I don't really know. I don't really know how this matters, apart from the fact that I think this is a story worth telling.
Yeah, well, I don't know if this matters either, but your comment, I'll just kind of offer a concluding reflection. Your comment around the imperative of transparency is what inspired me both to attempt to analyze materiality this way and to start with Google. Because so far, in my experience of materiality analyses conducted for any company in any sector following the kind of received methodology, it's a black box. And the only transparent or visible elements is sort of the list of issues that comes out the other end that honestly anybody could have put there. So there's a great lack of transparency in the methodology. And then if you go into the deeper layer of what really matters, you get to, there's a great lack of transparency in what's actually going on. For all the reasons you describe, I think that's something that we need to change. So I potentially completely incorrectly believe that it's worth just trying to do it anyway and see what comes of this. So that's the spirit of this. In that spirit, thank you very much for giving your time and your expertise and your thoughts. I really, really appreciate it. So thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you very much.